This is the Bible Book Club,
the book of Nehemiah.
Welcome to the club. Last time in chapter 1 of Nehemiah, he received a visit from his brother and heard that the exiles were in trouble. He immediately perceived the problem. The city of Jerusalem was at risk for attack, and that meant the people could be taken captive and the rebuilt temple could be destroyed again. Nehemiah was so struck by the implication that he mourned for days. His passion drove him to ponder and pray about what should be done and who would do it. Considering his own strategic position as cupbearer to the king, he came to the obvious conclusion. He needed to be willing to take responsibility should God choose to open the door. And with this thought in mind, Nehemiah prayed.
Okay, everybody knows by now, I think, hopefully, that I love Nehemiah if you heard the last episode. And here's why. He was a man of purpose and strategy. He provided a pattern for us to follow. And I love having a set of instructions, and that's kind of how I think of him. He perceived the situation. He pondered the problem. He used passion to be a force. He prayed for direction and favor. He patiently waited for opportunities. He methodically developed a plan, and he persevered through opposition. So in the last episode, we discussed how Nehemiah perceived, pondered, and prayed because he was so passionate about God and his people. This was Nehemiah's heart work, his motivation, what we talked about last week. In this episode, we will read how Nehemiah patiently prepared and planned. This is Nehemiah's mind at work. This is his strategy kicking in. And perhaps that is a point for us to consider already. The heart fuels the mind. Solomon seemed to think so, for he put it in Proverbs.
Proverbs 4, verse 23. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it.
So let's jump into scene 1. Nehemiah patiently waited for an opportunity.
Chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king.
So normally you would probably gloss over that verse and not realize that this is an example of how Nehemiah was patient. It has been 4 months since he heard the news from his brother. In chapter 1, we learned that Nehemiah heard the news about his people in the month of Kislev, which is November, December. Here, in the beginning of chapter 2, we learned that it wasn't until the month of Nisan, March, April, that he finally got his chance to do something about his people's devastating situation. From Kislev to Nisan, 4 months. It took 4 long months for Nehemiah's opportunity to present itself. Yet nowhere does it say that Nehemiah was frustrated or contemplating giving up. Nehemiah had caught a vision for rebuilding the wall, and he trusted it would happen. He handed the whole problem over to God in prayer and went on with his business in complete confidence that if God wanted to use him, he would present the opportunity. Recall, he ended the last chapter with, I was cupbearer to the king. Like, it could happen. I see the king all day, every day. Scene 2, Nehemiah prepared.
Continuing in verse 1, I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so I can rebuild it.
Nehemiah was prepared for this opportunity in 3 different ways. First, note that Nehemiah was prepared with right relationships, and relationships do not happen overnight. Because Nehemiah had developed a close relationship with the king actually cared about him. The most powerful king in the world noticed Nehemiah's expression. Not only did he notice, but he was so familiar with Nehemiah that he was able to infer three things with assurance from his observation. He said Nehemiah was sad. He said Nehemiah was not ill, and therefore he must be suffering from sadness of the heart. Part of this familiarity came with the job. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. The cupbearer to the king was a position of great influence in Nehemiah's day. The cupbearer was responsible for ensuring that the king's wine was not poisoned. But the position had evolved beyond the simple tasting of wine. Because of his constant access to the king, the cupbearer acquired influence beyond even that of some military leaders and nobles. In some periods of history, the cupbearer was more like a chief of staff. The reason for this is obvious. Only the most trusted of servants got the life-saving job. The king would have to be completely convinced of a servant's loyalty to himself alone, or risk that the servant could be bribed to poison the king. With few people that he could trust, it is understandable that a king might form a relationship with a loyal cupbearer. How in the world did Nehemiah, a foreigner, an exile from a country that had been enslaved with no connections that we know of, work his way into such an influential position? I am sure his rise in the kingdom ladder did not happen overnight or because he knew someone. Nehemiah held a noble position because he possessed a noble character. He was a man of integrity, humility, and faithfulness. Nehemiah could be trusted. Preparation for God's opportunities begins with relationships. Because of Nehemiah's character, he went from the business of protecting one life, King Artaxerxes, from his enemies, to protecting thousands of lives, the Israelites, from their enemies. All right. On top of that, Nehemiah was prepared for this opportunity because he had confidence that came from faith. I love the part of Nehemiah's story where he confidently makes his request of the king. It is the perfect picture of heaven and earth coming into alignment in preparation for some great work. Nehemiah's desires were in alignment with God's will. God wanted Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem to protect his people, and Nehemiah was willing to do it. The only thing standing in the way was one very powerful king, but that was not a problem for God. He is the King of Kings. Nehemiah knew this. The knowledge that God can do anything gave Nehemiah confidence. It made him bold. But it doesn't negate the fact that Nehemiah was human. So human, before he begins his request, he tells us what he is thinking. He was very much afraid. Of course he was. His job as cupbearer was to be calm, cool, collected, and trustworthy. Anything else on the face of the cupbearer could upset the king. It could imply Nehemiah was nervous about poisoning. And if it displeased the king could fire or kill him. Despite his fear, Nehemiah sees his God-given opportunity. Lastly, Nehemiah was prepared because he had mastered the art of diplomacy. Listen to this. This is crazy. He's so ingenious. He uses very few words, but every word counts. He began his plea with deference. May the king live forever. Verse 3. Then he simply stated succinctly and without political implications his personal grief over his people's plight. In other words, it's his grief. He's just expressing his emotions. I do not think Nehemiah's opening statement was by accident. He needed to assert his loyalty to the king, and he also needed to avoid the politics of why his people were in their situation, as it could have offended the king, implying it was his fault. Nehemiah had thought it out. He presented the problem from a position of personal grief, not political outrage. Nehemiah did not get caught up with who was to blame for the situation and how to seek justice. He just wanted to move forward and make his people secure. The effect of Nehemiah's strategy, the king became sympathetic. His concern and care for the faithful servant suffering before him diverted his thoughts from the political implications of the Israelites' situation. Moved to help Nehemiah, the king simply asked, "What is it you want?" I wish I could have been in the room. Did it go silent? I imagine there were many other servants and dignitaries hanging around. Kings are never alone. Were they shocked that the king had just asked a servant, "What is it you want?" Were they holding their breath to hear what Nehemiah would ask for? What did the king mean? If Nehemiah asked for too much, would the king blow up? Could they feel the presence of God, the King of Kings, as his spirit moved through the room to move the most powerful king on earth? The next verse tells us that before Nehemiah uttered a word in response, he prayed to the God of heaven. He prayed. And in that one breath of a prayer, I think the room shifted. The earth moved to align with heaven. The plans of one man locked into place with the plans of God. Faith can move a mountain. And Nehemiah's utter dependence on God and faith in God was about to move his mountain, the king of Persia. Long after Nehemiah, Jesus said this.
In Matthew 17, verse 20, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you."
Nehemiah boldly and simply asked for the impossible with ingenious deference, if it pleases the king. In other words, because you're king and your needs come first, and if your servant has found favor in his sight. In other words, if I have done a good job for you, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. In other words, I want to serve the ones I love in the same faithful way that I have served you, the king. So rational. No big political deal. I care for the king and I care for my people. And that was all it took.
Continuing in verse 6, "Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, 'How long will your journey take? And when will you get back?' It pleased the king to send me, so I set a time."
Nehemiah's preparation paid off. He found favor. Because Nehemiah had been faithful, he found favor with both the king of Persia and the King of Kings. I think it's so interesting too, this is just an aside, that we get to know that the queen was there. If it kind of lets our imagination explore a little more. Like, did the king and queen have a chat about Nehemiah? Like, oh, we just love him. He has such a good heart, you know? Did she weigh in on the subject? Had Nehemiah found favor with her too? She must have, because they're kind of sitting there in agreement. It's all so intriguing. And I wish so much we knew more about the relationships behind the scenes. Well, many of you who have been on the Bible Book Club journey with us from the beginning know that my favorite Bible verse is Revelation 3:8.
"I know your deeds. See, I have placed before you an open door that no one can shut. I know that you have little strength, yet you have kept my word and have not denied my name."
Nehemiah is a picture of this verse. Nehemiah's deeds were faithful, so he found favor with the king. Nehemiah kept God's word and did not deny his name, so he found favor with the King of Kings. Nehemiah had earned the favor of two kings, his earthly king and his heavenly king. And that is why God placed this opportunity, this open door that no one could shut in front of just this one man, Nehemiah. It's something for us to think about. We know from Luke verse 252 that Jesus grew in favor with God and man. What about you? How and with whom have you found favor? Ponder and pray about that. It's not about your strength or talent or situation. Finding favor is all about keeping God's word and being faithful to him. With favor, God will give you opportunities, open doors that no one can shut, because you have kept his word. Well, the king was pleased to let Nehemiah go, and with the king's pleasure secured, Nehemiah boldly took his request to the next level. Scene 3, Nehemiah presented his plan.
Now back to our story in Nehemiah 2, continuing in verse 7. I also said to him, if it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall, and for the residence I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my requests. So I went to the governors of Trans-Euphrates and gave them the king's letters. The king had also sent army officers and cavalry with me.
4 months had passed in our story, and Nehemiah had patiently been waiting for an opportunity. This is not to say that he had been sitting around doing nothing. Quite the contrary. Nehemiah had been preparing a plan. We don't know exactly what he was doing, but based on his response to the opportunity that arose, it is clear he had been considering his options. He left nothing to chance. He had pondered the situation and was prepared to present as many details of his plan as he could. Preparation is guaranteed paralysis prevention. When we are unprepared, we panic. And when we panic, we become paralyzed. Nehemiah never panicked. His reaction to the king's unexpected question, "What is it you want?" was flawless. Nehemiah had never even seen the city of Jerusalem or the wall, but he knew what he would need. Letters to prove that he was on a mission with the king's permission, and that meant letters for authority, security, and resources. And then because God is good and gracious and helps us out in a million ways we don't even notice, God moved the king to give Nehemiah something he didn't even ask for, a royal escort of army officers. What a gift. So big that Nehemiah would have never asked for it. Recall that Ezra didn't. He was afraid to ask this very same king for an escort. How many years ago? We discussed it in Ezra. Perception, pondering, passion, prayer, and patience are the foundations for being prepared and developing a plan. The lesson for us is that we cannot be afraid to move forward if we don't have all the information. God can lead one step at a time. Keep your eye on the path before you. And if you're going to look up, don't get confused looking ahead of you. Look all the way up to the real director of the show and trust in him. If that doesn't work, then look back down and hit your knees in prayer until you can look up again, but with confidence. Scene 4, the opposition takes note.
Verse 10. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about this, they were very much disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites.
The opposition rarely ignores a step forward in God's plans. Part of being prepared is to know that when God gives you an opportunity, the enemy will notice and a counterplot will be initiated. Sanballat and Tobiah will serve as the primary forces of opposition for the rest of the story. Sanballat was the governor of Samaria. Now, Samaria was north of Judah. It was the former capital of the northern kingdom of Israel after the kingdom divided, way back in Kings. Remember that? 1st and 2nd Kings. But it had become a region of mixed population after the Assyrian deportations. Sanballat was not an Israelite, most likely either a Moabite or Babylonian. Now, the Moabites, this is kind of interesting, were descendants of Abraham's nephew, Lot, and his older daughter. Remember, there was some incest there. Tobiah was a high-ranking Ammonite official. Now, recall that the Ammonites were long-standing enemies of the Israelites also. They were not descendants of Canaanites. The Ammonites were descendants of Lot with his younger daughter. So you can see Israel, Sanballat, and Tobiah were all related to Abraham. But Sanballat and Tobiah were closer. They were both descendants of Lot. The last thing Sanballat and Tobiah need in their region is for Jerusalem to gain power like they had way back in the day of all the other kings.
All right, Susan, can you give us the backstory here of Lot and his descendants? Because some of our listeners might not have been with us when we did Genesis.
So remember, Lot was Abraham's nephew. Mm-hmm. They accumulated too much stuff. And they had to separate.
Yeah.
Lot looks up. Abraham said, "You choose." Lot looked up and he saw the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it attracted him. And so he took his family and his herds and his people and lived there. And of course, they were drawn into temptation and sin, and not as bad as the people there, because remember, the angels came and
got them out.
Well, yeah, got just Lot and his daughters out. His wife died. Yeah. Well, then he and his daughters had to go live in hiding in a cave, and the daughters had grown up in this sin and tricked him, got him drunk and tricked him because they knew no one would marry them. Yeah, and they had incest. And so they had the Ammonite people and the Moabite people. So these people are not Canaanites, i.e. to be destroyed, but they were not all in on Israel either.
Related, but not really part of Israel anymore because they strayed.
So remember, Ruth is from Moab. So the Moabites kind of lived southeast of Jerusalem, kind of right below the Dead Sea. And from time to time, they were frenemies. Scene 5, Nehemiah adds intel to the plan.
Verse 11. I went to Jerusalem, and after staying 3 days, I set out during the night with a few others. I had not told anyone what my God had put in my heart to do for Jerusalem. There were no mounts with me except the one I was riding on. By night, I went out through the valley gate toward the jackal well and the dung gate, examining the walls of Jerusalem, which had been broken down, and its gates, which had been destroyed by fire. Then I moved on toward the fountain gate and the king's pool, but there was not enough room for my mount to get through. So I went up the valley by night, examining the wall. Finally, I turned back and re-entered through the valley gate. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I had said nothing to the Jews or the priests or nobles or officials or any others who would be doing the work.
This was a covert operation. Picture this. Nehemiah rode into town with what must have been an impressive show for this struggling group of Israelites. He had army officers and a cavalry straight from the king. He visits with them for 3 days, or at least they probably thought he was just visiting with them, because he told them nothing about why he was there. Now, I think knowing his diplomatic personality, he put them immediately at ease and just let them chatter while he covertly took detailed notes for that ever-evolving plan in his mind. No doubt he gathered information from old men woefully complaining about needing a new wall, from young men boasting about their dreams beyond the wall, and from women gossiping about the scandal within the walls. Then, after he heard all he needed to hear about that wall, he set out to see the wall for himself, alone. Nehemiah was appropriately sneaky. He used his well-honed power of discernment to separate fact from fiction so that he could correctly assess the problem and the strategy required to address it. There are a few lessons to be learned about how to gather information for a plan like Nehemiah. Sometimes covert is the way to go. Nehemiah never told anyone while he was in Jerusalem. He did not feel obligated to give information to these people. His plan was still in development. Nehemiah, the leader, knew that a well-formed plan would be well received. Had he openly discussed with only half-formed ideas and understanding to the city's inhabitants, they may have lost confidence in his ability to lead them. Instead, he listened and observed. Listening is essential. Nehemiah listened for 3 days. To be a good listener, you must be able to get people to talk. Observation is essential. Nehemiah knew that a picture is worth 1,000 words. He personally examined the wall alone. He didn't rely solely on reports about the wall. You almost get the feeling that after 3 days of listening, He was looking for missing pieces of information, or maybe he was getting conflicting information and needed to verify it with his own eyes. The point is, think for yourself before consulting with others. Nehemiah did not consult with the few who went with him on the tour of the wall. There's much to be gained from unbiased observation. This does not negate seeking the counsel of others on a subject, but know for yourself as much about the facts as you can. Then if you do ask others, be sure that they have carefully weighed and prayed about their guidance so you are not wrongly influenced. In the end, before you confirm your strategy, pray for the eyes, ears, and mind to understand all that you have learned. Scene 6. Nehemiah adds people to the plan.
Verse 17. Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God on me and what the king had said to me. They replied, let us start rebuilding. So they began this good work.
Nehemiah had assessed the situation in Jerusalem, and he had confirmed his strategy. He was now ready to add people to the plan and build a team. To convince others of a vision, a leader needs to be persuasive. Without it, a leader must resort to authoritarian control, and rules without relationship lead to rebellion. We have already established that Nehemiah was good at relationships. Here, he used simple word choices to get immediate buy-in from the people. First, he was inclusive. It says, then I said to them. The them he was referring to were the Jews, priests, nobles, officials, and community who had most likely been gathered in an assembly. This was not the time for secrecy. He wanted everyone to be compelled openly to accept or reject his plan without any opportunity for someone to hear it incorrectly from another source. He was also associative. Nehemiah was careful to use pronouns such as we and us to let the people know he had come not to be a ruler over them, but to be a leader with them. Then he cast a vision. Though Nehemiah began by reminding the people of where they were, Jerusalem lies in ruins and its gates have been burned, he finished by casting a vision of where they could be. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, he said, and we will no longer be in disgrace. He was also transparent. Nehemiah told the people without hesitation that it was God's hand and the king's blessing that had made his vision possible. He humbly admitted he couldn't do the job alone. Scene 7. The opposition fires a shot.
Verse 19. But when Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite official, and Geshem the Arab heard about it, they mocked and ridiculed us. What is this you are doing? They asked. Are you rebelling against the king? I answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We, his servants, will start rebuilding. But as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it.
So we already read that Sanballat and Tobiah were disturbed about the news that Nehemiah had arrived. Now, apparently, they've learned that the people are all in and the project is gathering momentum. So they add a third, Geshem the Arab, to their team. They are arrogant and threatening in their accusation against Nehemiah, accusing him of rebelling against the king. Nehemiah does not take the bait. He reveals nothing, holding his cards, or should I say, his letters from the king himself, close to his vest. Instead, he throws down the God gauntlet and dares them to pick it up.
One of the things that excites Susan and I the most about Bible Book Club is getting together every week and being able to read and discuss these episodes.
The other thing we love is how quickly we are growing. So you can do both. You can invite someone to take the journey with you and at the same time, share Bible Book Club with others so that we can grow even more.
New episodes drop every Monday.